He buys a ranch for $5, then finds two Apache girls hanged inside. He had always dreamed of escaping the hustle and bustle of city life. The constant noise, the crowded streets, and the never-ending rush of people made him yearn for something different, something more peaceful. He dreamed of wide-open spaces, fresh air, and the feeling of freedom that only nature could provide. So when he saw the ad in the local newspaper, it felt like fate had finally smiled upon him. The ad was simple, offering a ranch for sale. The price? Just $5. The man couldn't believe his eyes. It sounded too good to be true. $5 for an entire ranch? There had to be a catch. But after thinking about it for a moment, his curiosity got the better of him. He had nothing to lose, and everything to gain. The possibility of starting a new life was just too tempting to pass up. He made the call, eager to learn more about this incredible offer. The person on the other end of the line was an older man who explained that the ranch had been in his family for generations, but after years of hardship, they were forced to sell it. The property had been abandoned for a long time, and the man assured him that the ranch was still standing, though it was a bit run down. There were no animals, no crops to tend to, and the house was in need of serious repair. But for only $5, the man could have it. The deal sounded almost too generous to pass up. Maybe it was a little odd, but the man figured he could always fix it up and turn it into a profitable venture. A few days later, he found himself driving to the ranch, his mind racing with possibilities. He couldn't stop imagining what life would be like, living on a ranch, far away from the constant noise and distractions of the city. He had always liked the idea of working the land, building something with his own hands, and experiencing the quiet beauty of nature. This ranch could be the perfect place for him to escape and start over. As he pulled up to the property, he couldn't help but feel a mix of excitement and uncertainty. The land stretched out before him, vast and empty, with nothing but the wind and the sound of rustling leaves. It was a far cry from the crowded streets he had left behind. He parked his car in front of the dilapidated farmhouse and stepped out, taking in the scene. The house was old, with broken windows and a sagging roof. It looked like it hadn't seen a lick of paint in years, and the paint that had once covered it was peeling off in strips. The front porch was creaky and unstable, and weeds had overrun the yard. Yet, despite its worn appearance, there was something strangely inviting about the place. It had character, a story to tell. He walked up the front steps and turned the handle, the door creaking open with a groan. Inside, the house smelled musty, as if it had been abandoned for far too long. Dust covered every surface, and cobwebs hung in the corners. It was clear that no one had lived here in years. Still, there was something comforting about the silence. It was the kind of silence that he had been craving for so long, peaceful and still, like the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The man spent the next few hours exploring the house and the land surrounding it. He found old furniture covered in dust and cobwebs, remnants of a life that had once been lived here. There were old books scattered on a shelf, their pages yellowed with age, and pictures hanging crookedly on the walls. The house had been left in a hurry, with no regard for the things that had been left behind. It was as if the previous owners had vanished overnight. Outside, the land stretched for miles. There was a small barn in the distance, its roof caved in and the walls rotting away. A few overgrown fields lay to the side, and a small creek ran through the property, its waters slow and steady. The place was beautiful, in its own wild way. But there was also something haunting about it, a feeling that something wasn't quite right. It was as if the land was hiding something, something that had been buried for a long time. As the sun began to set casting a warm golden light over the ranch. The man couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the faintest sound of something or someone moving in the distance. He looked around, but there was no one there. The land was completely empty, save for the tall grass and the distant trees. Still, the feeling lingered, like an invisible presence that he couldn't see, but that he knew was there. Shaking off the unease, he decided to make himself comfortable for the night. He lit a fire in the fireplace and sat down in an old chair, staring into the flickering flames. His mind wandered to the possibilities of what he could do with the ranch. Maybe he could raise cattle or start a small farm. There was so much potential here, so much that could be done. He felt a sense of hope and excitement for the future, even though the ranch was far from perfect. But as the night wore on, the eerie feeling wouldn't leave him. The wind picked up, howling through the trees and rattling the windows. The shadows seemed to move on their own, stretching and shifting in the corners of the room. It was almost as if the house was alive, breathing, watching. He tried to ignore the feeling, telling himself it was just his imagination, but it didn't ease the growing sense of discomfort. Before he could think too much about it, exhaustion took over, and he fell into a restless sleep. His dreams were filled with strange images, faces he didn't recognize, voices that whispered in the dark, and the feeling of being trapped. When he awoke the next morning, the sun was shining through the windows, and the world seemed calm again. But the feeling that something was off lingered, like a shadow that wouldn't let go. He spent the next few days working around the property, cleaning up the house and fixing what he could. But no matter how hard he tried to focus on the work, the feeling that something wasn't right kept creeping into his thoughts. There were times when he swore he could hear footsteps behind him or the rustle of someone moving in the distance. But whenever he turned around, there was nothing there. It was as though the land itself was holding on to something dark, something buried deep in its history. The man didn't know what it was, but he had the sinking feeling that he was about to find out. Days passed and the man worked tirelessly on the ranch. The work was difficult, but he enjoyed the peace that came with it. Each day he spent there, the land seemed to slowly reveal more of itself to him. He began to fix the house little by little, patching the roof, cleaning the windows, and clearing out the overgrown weeds that had taken over the yard. The barn, though a much larger project, was still standing, and he made it a priority to get it back into usable shape. It would be a perfect space for animals, he thought, or perhaps for storing tools and equipment. Yet, even as the work progressed, the strange feeling he had when he first arrived never left. It was always there, lingering in the background like a shadow he couldn't shake off. Sometimes it would intensify, especially at night. The wind would pick up, howling through the trees and causing the old house to creak and groan. The man would often lie awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering if there was something he was missing, something hidden just beneath the surface. One afternoon, as he was working in the barn, he stumbled upon something odd. It was a small wooden chest, tucked away behind a pile of old hay bales. The chest was covered in dust, and its once bright color had faded over the years, but it still had a certain weight to it. Intrigued, the man knelt down and carefully opened the chest. Inside there were a few pieces of old clothing, nothing too remarkable, and a stack of yellowed papers. He picked them up, dusting them off and unfolding one of the pages. It was written in a language he didn't recognize. The symbols were strange, almost foreign, and they seemed to dance across the paper in a way that unsettled him. He carefully put the papers back into the chest and closed it. There was no need to dig into something that could have just been left behind by the previous owners, but the chest and the strange papers stayed in the back of his mind. Something about them felt important, as though they were connected to the land in a way that he didn't fully understand. Over the next few days, the feeling of being watched began to grow stronger. The man could never quite place it, but it was as though the land itself was alive, observing his every move. The rustling of the trees, the whispers of the wind, it all seemed to carry a message, but one he couldn't decipher. And the shadows, especially at dusk, seemed to stretch unnaturally long, as if they were reaching out, grasping at him. One evening, after a long day of work, the man decided to take a walk around the property. He needed to clear his mind, to shake off the unsettling thoughts that had been bothering him. As he walked past the creek that ran through the land, he noticed something strange: footprints in the mud. They were fresh, and they appeared to be human. But the man was certain that he hadn't seen anyone else around for miles. The footprints led toward the woods at the edge of the property. He hesitated for a moment, unsure whether he should follow them. But his curiosity got the better of him. With each step, he felt the weight of the silence around him. It was as if the air had thickened, pressing against his chest, making it harder to breathe. The trees seemed to close in on him, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. He followed the tracks deeper into the woods, his heart racing with each step. The further he went, the more he felt the sense of unease growing. The trees blocked out the light of the setting sun, casting everything in a dark, shadowy haze. The air was thick with the smell of earth and damp leaves, and the sound of birds had faded, replaced by an eerie stillness. As he reached a small clearing, he saw something that made his blood run cold. There, in the center of the clearing, was a stone circle. It wasn't large, but it was unmistakable. The stones were weathered and covered in moss, but they formed a perfect circle, as if they had been placed there intentionally. The man couldn't explain why, but something about the circle felt wrong. It was as if the land had been marked in some way, marked by something ancient and powerful. He stepped closer to the stones, his footfalls quiet on the soft ground. As he reached out to touch one of the stones, he felt a sudden chill run down his spine. The air grew colder, and for a moment it felt as though the earth itself had stopped moving. The wind ceased, and the rustling of the trees faded into an unnatural silence. The man pulled his hand back, a sense of dread washing over him. His mind raced with questions. What were these stones? Who had placed them here? And why did they feel so alive? He knew then that there was something far more mysterious about the ranch than he had first realized. He turned to leave the clearing, but as he did, he caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of his eye. It was a figure standing at the edge of the woods. The man's heart skipped a beat. The figure was tall and cloaked in shadows, but he could make out enough to know it was a person. At least, it looked like one. For a moment they simply stood there, watching him. Then, before the man could react, the figure turned and disappeared into the trees. A chill ran through him, and he quickly made his way back to the house, his mind racing. Who had been standing in the woods, and why had they been watching him? He couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it wasn't human. That night, as he lay in bed, he tried to make sense of everything. The footprints, the stone circle, the figure in the woods, it was all connected somehow. But how? And why did it feel like the land was holding a secret, something it didn't want him to know? The wind picked up outside, howling through the trees. The house creaked and groaned, as if it, too, was uneasy. The man pulled the covers up around him, trying to block out the cold feeling that had settled deep in his bones. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't escape the sense that something was watching, waiting for him to uncover the truth. The next morning, the man woke with the feeling that something was not quite right. He couldn't shake the images from the previous night. The stone circle in the woods, the figure watching him, and the overwhelming sense of dread that had gripped him. He tried to tell himself it was just his imagination, that it was the isolation of the ranch playing tricks on his mind, but deep down, he knew something was off. He had been working hard to fix up the ranch, but now, with the strange events weighing on him, the tasks felt less like a way to build a new life and more like an attempt to outrun something he couldn't quite understand. He decided that today he would focus on getting the barn in better shape. It was a big job, but it would keep him busy, and maybe if he stayed occupied, he could push the nagging thoughts to the back of his mind. As he walked toward the barn, he noticed something that made him stop in his tracks. A part of the fence had been broken. It wasn't the result of anything he had done. This was fresh damage. The wood was splintered, and the posts had been torn from the ground. His heart skipped a beat. Who would have done this? There was no one for miles. Could it be animals? But the damage looked deliberate, almost as if someone had tried to force their way through. He bent down to inspect the fence more closely, but the sound of something shifting behind him made him freeze. His breath caught in his throat as he slowly turned around. Nothing. The wind rustled the trees, and the world seemed still again, as if it had been holding its breath. But, in that moment, the man realized something. It wasn't just the wind. It was a quiet that felt almost unnatural, like the air itself had thickened, and the earth had gone silent. His instincts told him to leave, to get in the house and lock the door, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. He had come this far. He had already chosen to stay, to live this life, so he couldn't run from it now. With a sigh, he picked up the tools he had dropped and started to fix the fence, trying to shake off the tension that clung to the air. But as the day wore on, the feeling that he was being watched returned, stronger than before. It was as though the trees themselves were staring at him, their twisted branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. He couldn't focus on his work. Every time he lifted his head, he thought he saw something moving in the corner of his vision. At first, he thought it was just the wind, but the more it happened, the more he became convinced that there was something, or someone, out there. After a few hours, he decided he couldn't ignore it anymore. He had to figure out what was going on. He grabbed a flashlight and headed toward the woods once again, hoping to get to the bottom of the strange occurrences. This time, he wasn't just going to walk into the woods blindly. He needed answers. The trees seemed to loom over him as he walked, their shadows stretching longer and darker as the sun began to set. The quiet was unsettling. Even the usual chirping of birds seemed to have stopped. As he reached the clearing where the stone circle was, his pulse quickened. The circle was just as he had left it, but there was something new. At the center of the circle, lying on the ground, was a bundle of old clothes, faded and worn, like they had been left here for a long time. They were nothing special, just a few simple garments, but they looked out of place, as if they didn't belong. Cautiously, the man approached the clothes. He could feel the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. His gut told him to turn back, but his curiosity won out. He bent down and gently touched the clothes, brushing off the dirt and leaves. Beneath the layers of dust, he could make out a symbol stitched into the fabric. It was the same strange symbol he had seen on the papers he found in the chest. The realization hit him like a wave. The clothes were connected to whatever secret the land was hiding. Suddenly, he heard a rustling noise from behind him. He spun around, the flashlight shaking in his hand. There, at the edge of the woods, he saw the same figure he had seen the night before. But this time, it was closer. It was taller than any man he had ever seen, and though he couldn't make out many details, It was impossible to ignore the presence of this figure. It stood perfectly still, watching him. The man's heart hammered at his chest, and every instinct told him to run. But he couldn't move. It was as if his legs were frozen in place, as if the figure held him there with some unseen force. The silence between them stretched on, and the man felt the weight of the moment sink into his bones. What did it want from him? Why was it watching him? And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure turned and vanished into the woods. The man stood there for a long time, unable to move or speak. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. He had seen it clearly. There was no denying it. The figure was real, but what was it? Why was it so intent on watching him? With his heart still pounding, he backed away from the stone circle and the strange clothes. He didn't want to stay another moment in that place. As he hurried back to the ranch, he couldn't shake the feeling that the figure was still out there, following him. He looked over his shoulder constantly, half expecting to see the figure standing in the shadows, watching him from afar. When he finally reached the house, he locked the door behind him and leaned against it, trying to catch his breath. His mind was spinning, filled with questions and fear. What was the land hiding? What was the figure? And what did it want? He couldn't stay here much longer. The ranch was becoming more than just a place to live. It was turning into a puzzle, one with pieces that didn't seem to fit together. But despite the fear, despite the unknowns, part of him couldn't bring himself to leave. There was something about the land, something that drew him in. He knew that he had to find out what was going on, even if it meant facing whatever dark forces were at play. The following days felt like a blur. The man couldn't shake off the strange experiences that had been happening at the ranch. No matter how much he tried to focus on fixing up the house or working on the land, his thoughts kept drifting back to the woods, the stone circle, and the figure that seemed to be watching him. The land itself felt different, as though it were alive and waiting for something to happen. Every time he stepped outside, there was a feeling of being watched, and it weighed heavily on him. He spent a lot of time in the barn after that strange encounter, trying to keep his mind occupied. It was the one place that felt safe, the one place where he could work and not feel like something was lurking just outside his view. But even there, the unease lingered. He would often hear strange noises, soft creaks and groans that sounded like footsteps moving through the barn, even though there was no one there. One afternoon, as he was working on fixing a few broken beams in the barn, he decided to take a break and step outside for some fresh air. The wind was blowing and the trees were swaying gently, but there was something different about the way the air felt. It felt heavier, thicker, as if something was about to happen. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, and the world around him seemed to quiet down. The birds stopped chirping, and the usual hum of insects was absent. As he stood there, staring at the horizon, a sense of dread slowly settled over him. It was as though the land was holding its breath, waiting for something to unfold. He turned around, and that's when he saw it. Something in the distance, just beyond the trees, moving slowly toward him. The figure. At first, he wasn't sure if he was seeing things. The figure was far away, partially obscured by the trees, but it was unmistakable. Tall, dark, and cloaked in shadow, it seemed to glide effortlessly through the trees, its movements slow and deliberate. The man's heart pounded in his chest as he watched, frozen in place. His body screamed at him to run, but his feet wouldn't move. It was like the air had thickened around him, making it hard to breathe. The figure didn't stop. It kept moving toward him, and before he knew it, it was standing at the edge of the trees, just beyond the reach of the setting sun's fading light. The man's breath hitched as he realized that it was closer than he had ever seen it before. He had no idea what it was or what it wanted, but it was real, and it was watching him. He stood there, unable to move, feeling the weight of the moment settle over him. The figure did not speak, nor did it make any gesture. It simply stood there, watching him with an intensity that sent chills down his spine. The silence between them felt suffocating, as if the whole world had paused, waiting for something to happen. The man knew he couldn't stand there forever. He had to do something. With a deep breath, he turned and began walking back toward the house, his steps quick and hurried. But as he reached the front door, he dared to look over his shoulder. The figure was still there, watching him, but it had not moved. Inside the house, the man slammed the door shut behind him. Locking it with trembling hands, he leaned against the door, trying to steady his breathing, his heart racing in his chest. He couldn't explain what he had seen, but he knew it was real. He had felt it in his bones. The figure was not some figment of his imagination. It was something far more real, something far more dangerous. As the evening wore on, the man couldn't shake the image of the figure standing in the woods, staring at him with those dark, unblinking eyes. He tried to ignore the sense of fear creeping through his veins, but it was impossible. He had come to this ranch for a fresh start, but now it felt like the land was pulling him into something dark and unknown. He couldn't leave. He had no place to go, but staying here seemed impossible. That night, he barely slept. The sounds of the wind outside and the creaking of the house only added to the tension he felt. Every time he closed his eyes, he could see the figure standing just outside his window, watching him with those cold eyes. He kept telling himself it was all in his head, that it was just the isolation playing tricks on him. But deep down, he knew it wasn't. The next morning, he made a decision. He couldn't keep going on like this, living in fear, wondering when the next strange thing would happen. He had to face whatever was haunting the land, whatever had been watching him, and he had to do it now. The more he stayed here, the more the land seemed to claim him, pulling him into its dark grip. He gathered what little courage he had left and walked to the stone circle. He wasn't sure why, but something told him that the answers he was looking for lay there. The circle had been the source of so many strange things, and he felt drawn to it as though it held the key to understanding what was happening. When he reached the clearing, the air felt different. The trees seemed to loom over him, casting long shadows that made the space feel smaller and more oppressive. He stepped into the center of the stone circle, his heart pounding in his chest. As he stood there, the wind died down, and the world seemed to fall into a heavy silence. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, just as he began to think it was all in his head, he heard something. Faint whispers, as though voices were coming from the ground itself. He knelt down, his heart racing, and touched the earth beneath him. The whispers grew louder, but still, he couldn't understand what they were saying. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. He had to focus. He had to understand what was happening. The whispers continued, swirling around him. But then, something changed. The earth beneath his hands seemed to shift, and the stones around him began to hum with energy. It was subtle at first, but soon it became undeniable. The stones were alive. Suddenly, the air around him grew cold, and a figure appeared in the center of the circle. It was the same figure he had seen before, but now it was closer, standing right in front of him. The man could feel the weight of its presence, and as it stepped forward, the whispers stopped. The figure was taller than before, its dark form almost swallowing the light around it. It was as if the land itself had come alive, taking shape before his eyes. Without speaking, the figure raised its hand, and the man could feel the earth tremble beneath him. The whispers returned, louder now, as if they were speaking directly to him. He couldn't understand the words, but he understood the meaning. The land was angry, and it wanted something from him. It had been waiting for him to come, waiting for him to uncover its secrets. The man took a step back, his heart pounding in his chest. This was no longer just a place to escape to. It was something much older, much darker. And the figure in front of him wasn't just watching him. It was waiting for him to make a choice. The choice that would decide his fate, and perhaps the fate of the land itself.